These two are the two most powerful countries. Even if there is no sectarian divide between these two, I think there would still be some kind of competition between these two because they would be vying for influence in West Asia. In the name of attacking the American bases, Iran can ravage these countries in the event of a war. Okay, they can do the same thing back, but it would be disastrous for both sides. So Saudi Arabia and the UAE were particularly vulnerable. So what they did was that they decided to, instead of competing with the Iranians, going into a conflict with the Iranians, they opted for some kind of a détente with the Iranians. Iran has been under American sanctions. Iran is not allowed to basically tap into its real potential. Yeah. It's treated as some kind of an outcast in the region because the region is surrounded by American allies.
In light of what is happening right now with the Israel-Hamas war and the tensions in the Red Sea, what would you say is the influence that Iran has on the ground? Iran sits at the heart of one of the world's most volatile regions. From its rivalry with Saudi Arabia to its growing influence in Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, and Yemen, Tehran's ambitions stretch far beyond its borders. Its relationships with global powers like China, Russia, and the United States, as well as its historic ties with India, are being tested in a rapidly shifting geopolitical landscape. In the previous episode, we explored the history of Iran and its internal politics, tracing the revolution of 1979, the evolution of its political system, and the domestic factors that shaped Tehran's decisions on the world stage. In this episode of Global Faultlines, we take a deep dive into Iran's complex web of alliances, rivalries, and strategic calculations. We ask how much of its regional influence is driven by ideology and how much by hard power. How sustainable are its partnerships with global heavyweights, and what does all this mean for the stability of West Asia and the wider world? Joining me to discuss all this is Stanley Johnny, the Hindu's International Affairs editor. This is Global Faultlines, and I am Sharmada Venkatasubramanian. So, Iran sits at the heart of a very tense region, right? So, to start with, how would you describe Iran's relation with its Gulf neighbors, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and the UAE? And how does that affect the regional situation there?
See, in the last episode, we talked a little bit about the immediate response of Iran's Gulf neighbors towards the revolution after 1979. Nobody took the revolution lightly because it's republicanism. It's also religious republicanism, Islamic republicanism, which all these countries, all of them were monarchies, except Iraq. All the neighboring countries were monarchies. So they all felt threatened. Okay, so from the initial phase onwards, the relationship between Iran and the Arab countries across the Gulf, it wasn't great. And Iran also fought the 80-year-long war with Iraq, and Iraq was directly backed by the Gulf Arabs, the Persian Gulf Arabs. But then if you take, a longer view of history, of the contemporary engagement between Iran and the Gulf Arab countries, look at where they stand today. So we can look at the three countries that you mentioned, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and the UAE, because these three are the main powers. Because if you look at Kuwait and Oman, particularly Oman, Iran has a very decent relationship with Oman. Oman is not directly involved in this power tussle in the region. Oman always projects itself as a mediator. With Qatar, Iran enjoys a relatively good relationship with Qatar. Because remember, there was a blockade on Qatar in 2017, right? So 2015, Saudi Arabia had the new king, King Salman bin Abdulaziz. And Mohammed bin Salman, Salman's son, became the defense minister. He became the crown prince much later.
Right.
So in 2015, today's MBS, who is also the prime minister of Saudi Arabia and the crown prince of Saudi Arabia, who is arguably the de facto leader of Saudi Arabia. So he starts rising after his father became the monarch in Saudi Arabia. So in 2017, MBS and Mohammed bin Zayed. Mohammed bin Zayed is the current president of the UAE. He at that time was also the crown prince of the UAE.
Right.
So both of them imposed a blockade on Qatar because their main problem with Qatar was that Qatar was supporting I mean, they claimed that Qatar was supporting terrorist organizations, but Qatar was supporting Islamist organizations like Muslim Brotherhood and different offshoots of Muslim Brotherhood in different countries in the region. So the Gulf Arabs turned against their fellow Gulf Arab Emirate, and there was a massive blockade. And blockade means no goods were being shipped. I mean, overland shipping was stopped, overland transfer was stopped, trade was stopped between Qatar and Saudi Arabia and the UAE. Whereas Iran kept all the channels open. So during that time, basically Iran and Qatar deepened their economic and trade relationship. And they also share a gas reserve in the Persian Gulf region, the Qataris and the Iranians. So they have a relatively stable relationship, and there is no direct, confrontation between these two. But at the same time, the Iranians always opposed Qatar hosting the American airbase in Al Udeid, because Qatar hosts America's largest airbase. So that angle is there. But despite that angle, they maintained some kind of a stable relationship. Whereas with Saudi Arabia, that's not the case. With the UAE, that's not the case. Both the UAE and Saudi Arabia saw Iran as a potential threat. Because in the case of Saudi Arabia, you see, Saudi Arabia in 2019, Saudi Arabia faced a massive attack on its oil installations, and those attacks were launched by the Houthis from Yemen. And Saudi Arabia has always accused Iran of backing the Houthis. So Saudi Arabia in the south has a long border with Yemen. So just across the border, the land is controlled by an Iran-backed Shia militia group, which poses security threats to Saudi Arabia. And also, if you look at the region, West Asia in general, until recently, there were pro-Saudi regimes, and there are pro-Iran militias. And so they were involved in some kind of confrontation. So the tension was there between Saudi Arabia and Iran.
Is it only because of religion? Because, of course, the Saudi and Iran rivalry has always been sort of framed as sectarian, like Sunni versus Shia. But is it just religious, or would you say it's also about the geopolitical power struggle between those two?
I would always place geopolitics above religion, but religion is a factor. We are not dismissing religion altogether, because Saudi Arabia is a Sunni Wahhabi kingdom, whereas Iran is a Shia theocratic republic. You see multiple contradictions here. One is Sunni, Shia. You see the sectarian divide. Wahhabism is the most strident version of one of the most strident versions of Islam. So the clergy in Saudi Arabia, the Wahhabi clergy was very powerful, and they had their own code, right? Saudi Arabia started allowing women to drive only recently, 2018, I think. So, which means until then, the Wahhabi clergy had a very, tight control over the Saudi socio-political system, even though the country is ruled by the Al Saud family. Whereas in the case of Iran, so on the one side it is Sunni, and on the other side Saudi Arabia is Sunni, Saudi Arabia is Wahhabi. On the other side, across the Gulf, Iran is majority Shia. And it is ruled by what we discussed in our last episode, the Vilayati Faqih, the jurisprudence of the cleric, right? So it's a clerical system, and it's also a republic. It's the Islamic Republic of Iran. It's not a kingdom. It used to be a kingdom. So you have multiple contradictions here. Sectarianism, religious ideology, and republicanism versus monarchy. Plus, you also have the geopolitics. Which means in the region, you just look at the map, you have the Gulf. The Gulf is immensely rich in terms of oil resources, natural gas resources. And on the one side of the Gulf, you have the GCC countries, right? And among the GCC countries, Saudi Arabia is the most powerful country, arguably the most influential country, in terms of landmass, in terms of population, in terms of energy resources, and in terms of its cultural heft, because the king of Saudi Arabia is also the guardian of the two holiest places in Islam, Mecca and Medina. So the king has that heft, right? That cultural heft. And just across the Gulf, you look at Iran, again, in terms of the landmass, in terms of population, and in terms of natural resources. Okay, Iran is not allowed to tap into its potential because of the US sanctions. But you look at the natural resources, because we saw that on the one side it has the Gulf and on the other side it has the Caspian Sea. So these two are the two most powerful countries. Even if there is no sectarian divide between these two, I think there would still be some kind of competition between these two, because they would be vying for influence in West Asia. So religion is a factor, but there are multiple contradictions between Saudi Arabia and Iran. And the UAE is another interesting case, because in 2020, UAE signed the Abraham Accords with the Israelis, basically under America's negotiations. So why did the UAE do that? Okay, on the one side, the UAE always had backroom contacts with Israel, and the Americans were promoting a new vision of bringing the Arab world and the Israelis together for what? As a common front against the Iranians. So the UAE also saw that Iran as a major threat, because Iran has all these, long-range missiles, short-range and long-range missiles. So UAE is a very small emirate, right? I mean, it is basically a collection of a group of emirates. And the glass cities of the emirates could collapse if there is an open confrontation between the Iranians and the Arabs. So the UAE always looked at Iran and then saw a potential threat. And the UAE had been building close ties with the Israelis on the one side. So both the Emiratis and the Saudis saw Iran as a potential threat. But that approach changed in recent years, because Saudi Arabia in 2023 signed a rapprochement agreement with the Iranians. So that approach is slowly changing. There are still tensions.
What was the 2023 rapprochement between Saudi Arabia and Iran? And is it actually standing, I mean, is it still in the works, or do you think the old rivalries are sort of simmering under the...
So the tensions still remain.
Right.
Because if you go back and read an interview Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman gave to the Atlantic magazine in the United States back in, I think, 2019 or 2020, he called Ayatollah Khamenei Hitler, modern Hitler. And then he also praised the Israelis, saying that Jews are very much part of West Asia's socio-cultural fabric, and Israel has the right to exist, to defend itself, etc., etc. It was a very interesting interview to the Atlantic magazine. So that's how he looked at the Iranians back in the day. But then, something happened. There was some kind of a lull when the JCPOA was there in place, which is the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the nuclear agreement negotiated by the Obama administration. 2018, Trump would decide to unilaterally withdraw the United States out of the JCPOA. And the Trump administration wanted to put maximum pressure on the Iranians. And the Iranians responded with maximum resistance, because they were pushing back the Americans and their allies. So the Iranians thought that if in the future there is a conflict, it is a possibility that the Emiratis and the Saudis would join hands with the Israelis and the Americans. So to preempt such an outcome, what they did was to use their proxies in the region to attack the Saudis and even the Emiratis. The Houthis had launched some ballistic missiles to Abu Dhabi. But in 2018, the attack on Saudi oil facilities were particularly disastrous, because it just knocked off half of Saudi Arabia's oil output for a week. So for Saudi Arabia, it was also a realization that they need to enter into some kind of a détente with the Iranians instead of going into war with the Iranians. Because Saudi Arabia realized that they were the low-lying countries just across the Gulf. Because Iran can, in the name of attacking the American bases, Iran can ravage these countries in the event of a war. Okay, they can do the same thing back, but it would be disastrous for both sides. So Saudi Arabia and the UAE were particularly vulnerable. So what they did was that they decided to, instead of competing with the Iranians, going into a conflict with the Iranians, they opted for some kind of a détente with the Iranians. And who played the role of a broker here? That's the most interesting thing. The Chinese did that. So in 2023, the agreement between the Iranians, the rapprochement between the Iranians and the Saudis were brokered by China, because China has a very good economic and strategic partnership with the Iranians. And the Chinese also have very vibrant economic partnership with the Saudis.
Right.
So they were acceptable to both sides. The Chinese were the only big power that was acceptable to both sides. The Americans were not, because the Iranians did not trust them, right? So the Chinese brokered this agreement, brought them together. So what Iran got, I think, out of the agreement is that the competition would make way for some kind of cooperation and stability in the relationship between these two. But the Saudis got was that the Iranians would put pressure on the Houthis, and the Houthis would stop attacking the Saudis, right? And the Saudis will also find that the security challenge from the south, from Yemen, that could be tackled.
Right.
It's been a couple of years, and I would argue that the agreement is still holding, in a sense that the Houthis are not attacking the Saudis anymore, because over the last 2 years, the Houthis made a lot of noise in the region, right? They started attacking ships in the Red Sea. They started attacking ships in the Arabian Sea. They still launch missiles and drones towards Israel, and the Israelis have bombed the Houthis. The Americans have bombed the Houthis. But the Saudi-Iran rapprochement survived all this.
Right.
Because when the Americans launched their Operation Prosperity Guardian or something, the Biden administration, against the Houthis, the Saudis decided to stay out of it.
Right.
They didn't join the coalition. And when the Houthis launched attack against all these powers, they spared the Saudis. They are not targeting the Saudis now. Instead, they are targeting ships in the Red Sea, or they are directly targeting the Israelis. Right. So I think both the Iranians and the Saudis still realize that the rapprochement should stay.
Right.
I'm not saying that it will continue or it will transform their relationship into a new kind of friendship. No. The deep mistrust is still there. Saudi Arabia, I think roughly 20% of Saudi population are Shias, and they face a lot of issues. There are allegations that they are being treated as second-class citizens in Saudi Arabia, and there were instances where the Saudi state executed Shia clerics in the past, which triggered issues among the Shia community. So Saudi Arabia has to manage its Shia minority.
Right.
So that element is still there, and the sectarian angle is also still there, and both countries will continue to strive for influence in the region. But still, on top of all this, they now realize that they need to maintain some kind of stability in their relationship.
So moving on, Iran has influence in countries like Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, and Yemen through its militias, politics, and strategic alliances. So first of all, how does Tehran manage these ambitions with the risks of, overextension? And also, how does its policies in these countries affect its energy security, military strategy, and also its trade routes? Say in the last, how is it affected in the last maybe 20 years? Would you say it's been more positive or negative?
See, if you look at it from Iran's point of view, you can look at it from Iran's point of view, you look at it from this particular country's point of view, you can have a regional perspective as well. You look at it from Iran's point of view, whatever Iran has done in building these networks, what the Iranians call the axis of resistance, that has served Iranian influence, right? Because we are talking about a country which has a lot of economic problems, and Iran has been under American sanctions. Iran is not allowed to basically, tap into its real potential. It's treated as some kind of an outcast in the region, because the region is surrounded by American allies, right? So Iran found that the only possibility for it to extend its influence is through this network.
Right.
So they built the Hezbollah in 1982 in Lebanon, in the background of the Israeli bombing of Lebanon. And they continued to maintain very close ties with the Shia parties in Iraq when Iraq was ruled by Saddam Hussein. Right. Saddam Hussein's party was the Ba'athist party, which on book was a secular party. But Saddam was a brutal dictator. No doubt about it, right? And the way Saddam treated the Shias and the Kurds was horrible. The Shias were the majority in Iraq, but they were treated as second-class citizens by Saddam's regime. And the Shias had different political organizations. One was the Al-Dawa party, and the other is the Supreme Council for the Islamic Revolution in Iraq. The Iranians always maintained very close ties with these groups, right? And once the Americans went into Iraq in 2003, destroyed the Iraqi state, toppled Saddam's regime, and the Americans wanted to democratize Iraq.
Yeah.
It turned out to be a disaster, but it also looked like they were giving Iraq on a platter to the Iranians, because they had already built very close ties with the Shia parties in the region in Iraq. So you can see this, no? What the Iranians are doing is exploiting a conflict situation to build their own corridors of influence. They did that in Lebanon.
Yeah.
Against the background of the Israeli bombing. They did that in Iraq against the background of the American invasion. They did that in Yemen against the background of the Arab Spring protests in Yemen, because after the protest, the government of Ali Abdullah Saleh collapsed and there was some kind of a vacuum in Yemen, and the Saudis established a new government of Mansur al-Hadi, and that government didn't have any roots. Nobody knows where Hadi is today. I think he is in Riyadh. The officially internationally recognized president of Yemen doesn't live in Yemen anymore. So there was a vacuum, and then the Houthis, who basically represent the Shia people, they marched on towards Sana'a and they captured Sana'a. And then in the aftermath of the Iraq war, the Iranians built a lot of militia groups inside Iraq. It's called Hashad al-Shabi. So this is how the Iranians built their corridors of influence, right? So from an Iranian point of view, it actually served Iran's interests. It's what we call the forward defense.
Right.
Iran built its influence across the region. But if you look at it from the particular country's point of view, do these militias make these countries stronger? No. All these countries are internally divided, right? In the case of Lebanon, Hezbollah is a much stronger army than the Lebanese military.
Yeah.
Okay, Hezbollah is being humbled now by the Israelis, but if you look at it from 1982 until recently, Hezbollah was a much bigger force, political and military force in Lebanon. Now, Houthis are definitely much more powerful than the officially recognized the government of Yemen. So the Houthis control Hodeidah, they control Sana'a, they control the Saudi border, they control parts of the Red Sea coast. So they seem to be pretty powerful there in Yemen. And then the Iraqi militia groups, right? They also remain powerful organizations inside Iraq. So it's through these groups that the Iranians are exerting their influence. So these countries stay divided, but for Iran, the axis of resistance groups serve Iran's interests. And from a regional point of view, this is basically a natural result of the regional power dynamics, because the Iranians always felt threatened by the regional situation.
Right.
The region is controlled by the United States and its allies, and all of them looked at Iran as an enemy. So Iran, for its own survival, what Iranians did to strengthen their own defenses, to continue to support all these militia groups, right? Which also included, Hamas and Islamic Jihad as well.
Yeah.
So, you can look at it from different perspectives and your perspectives will change. But from a regional point of view, this is basically, I'm not surprised that the Iranians over the last 40 plus years continue to support different militant groups in the region.
So again, like you just mentioned, we discussed this in the previous episode as well about Iran's support for different militant groups like Hezbollah and Hamas. So in light of what is happening right now with the Israel-Hamas war and the tensions in the Red Sea, so what would you say is the influence that Iran has on the ground?
Last 2 years, we have seen, a great deal of change in West Asia.
Yeah.
I've just written about it in the Hindu, about how the region has been reshaped over the past 2 years. So if you look at it from an operational military point of view, Iran has faced back-to-back setbacks. Right? Its regional influence is being rolled back. Hezbollah's militant infrastructure has been diminished and damaged, and its top leadership has been killed, including Hassan Nasrallah, who used to be a charismatic, very powerful leader of Hezbollah, was assassinated by the Israelis. Fawd Shukur was killed by the Israelis. Nasrallah's even designated successor was killed by the Israelis. So Hezbollah faced, and also the pager explosion practically knocked off communication and coordination between Hezbollah cadre. So Hezbollah suffered back-to-back setback. Hamas has been forced to reinvent itself as an insurgency. Hamas is no longer the militant group that used to control the whole of Gaza. Hamas's militant and administrative infrastructure has been damaged. Hamas hasn't been defeated. That's a different story.
Yeah.
But Hamas also faced military setback, right? And the Israelis bombed Iran. And Israel's bombing in Iran, the bombing campaign was not entirely successful because it failed to destroy Iran's nuclear facilities.
Yeah.
But still, the freedom with which the Israelis operated inside Iran, that's telling. That's quite telling, because that shows how deep Israel can. Israel is a very small country in the region. How deep Israel can penetrate into a country that is many, many times its size. So, if you look at it from a military point of view, yes, Iran's regime survived, and Iran's nuclear program also survived, but at the same time, its influence is being rolled back in the region. But Houthis are still standing, because Houthis are the government in Yemen.
Yeah.
Many people still refer to them as Houthi rebels, but Houthis, practically, they are the government. West may not recognize them as a government, but they control much of Yemen, and they control most of Yemen's population centers except in Aden in the south. So Iran's influence has been rolled back, but still, on the flip side is that Hamas hasn't been destroyed, defeated, and Hezbollah remains a powerful socio-political actor in Yemen. Now Hezbollah is under pressure to disarm itself. I doubt whether Hezbollah will do that. And if Hezbollah refuses to do that, I don't think the Lebanese government would be able to enforce demobilization of Hezbollah. They lack the muscle to do that. So Hezbollah still remains, and Houthis still remain a powerful actor. So Iran has faced a setback. Its influence, has declined, but still it retains the access of network in a different form in the region. It may not be as powerful as it was in September 2023.
Right.
But the rise of the Houthis, I think, gives Iran some, leverage in the region, especially in the Arabian Gulf, especially in the Arabian Peninsula, because the Houthis are there right across the Saudi border. That gives Iran some influence some leverage over the Arabian Peninsula. And the Americans bombed Houthis, the Saudis bombed Houthis, the Israelis bombed Houthis, and the Houthis are still there in Sana'a. So it looks like the Houthis have entrenched themselves into Yemen's political order, and these external bombing campaigns are not going to overthrow them.
Yeah.
So which also means that Iran has built some long-lasting influence in this particular region. So it's a mixed story.
Right.
It has faced military setback. Its influence has declined, but at the same time, it's not over yet.
Like we mentioned in our conversation earlier, so China is also a very important ally to Iran now. So Iran has very close allies with both China and Russia amid Western sanctions, of course. So what exactly does Tehran gain from this? And would you say Iran's foreign policies are affected because of its allies with, these global superpowers? Because again, like you mentioned, China has a good relationship with Saudi Arabia and many other countries, while Iran doesn't.
Yeah.
So does it affect Iran's foreign policy, or?
Yes, Iran has good ties with both the Chinese and the Russians. No question about that. But these ties are largely economic in nature.
Right.
With Russia, they have a strategic cooperation, but that is also one-sided. I will explain why it's one-sided. With China, yes, because when the whole world stopped doing trade with Iran in buying Iranian crude, including us, India, under pressure from the United States, we curtailed buying crude from the Iranians, but the Chinese continued to do that. And they found a mechanism to pay the Iranians. They continue to do business with the Iranians. So for Iran, Chinese market is important.
Right.
Trade relationship with China is important because Iran's economy otherwise is in serious trouble. They face hyperinflation, they face continued economic decline. Iran also faced back-to-back protests
Right.
inside the country. So for economic stability, I think it's important for the Iranians to maintain their relationship with the Chinese. So that's one thing. With Russia, they have a 25-year-long strategic partnership they signed. And the Iranians basically offered full support to the Russians over the Ukraine war, right? I was in Tehran when Putin launched the war in February 2022.
Right.
And I remember talking to Iranian diplomats in Iran's national gardens in Tehran, where the foreign ministry is situated. And they believed that the Russians will, the war will be like a walk in the park. The Russians will meet their objectives rather quick. You can't blame them. Everybody believed that back in February 2022. Their point of view was that Russia was forced to launch this war.
Right.
And the world is changing, the world order is changing, etc., etc. And when the war went on, and the Russians wanted Iranian support, and then they offered their kamikaze drones. They even apparently set up joint production facilities, the Iranians and the Russians, according to Western press, to produce drones at industrial scale, right? Hundreds of thousands of drones every year. So that the Russians could use them on the war front. If you look at the Ukrainian war front, both sides are using hundreds of drones every day. So the Iranians played a major role, and some reports even suggested that Iran had supplied short-range missiles to Russia. So which means Russia, and we know about North Korea. North Korea had sent troops to Russia. So Iran and North Korea had closely cooperated with the Russians in the Ukraine war. So when the Israelis bombed Iran in June, the Iranians expected some kind of support from the Russians, but nothing came from the Russians. I talked to some in Tehran after the war, and I asked them the same question. So they were actually upset. These are think tank people, not government officials, but they were actually upset with the fact that Russia didn't do much throughout the 12 days of war. So nobody came to Iran's defense or to help Iran's offense, right? So Iran was on its own. What the Iranians told me was that now they would look at diversifying their strategic partnership, or they would like to buy the Chinese weapons. But whether China would supply them, there were reports that China had agreed to supply new missile defense systems to Iran. The Middle East, I reported this, but the Chinese have not confirmed it. So we don't know the details, basically. But the Iranians were keen that they wanted to deepen their ties with the Chinese as well, their strategic cooperation with the Chinese as well, because they were not very particularly happy with the Russians or with the Russian response during this conflict. Having said that, Russia and China are the close major powers Iran has. And Iran continues to enjoy some kind of political and diplomatic support from both countries, because recently when the European powers reimposed the sanctions after the 10-year period of the JCPOA expired, both Russia and China opposed the European move at the UN, right? So there is still some kind of understanding between Russians and the Chinese. So how is this going to affect the Iranian? I think the Iranian foreign policy is not directly influenced by these countries. So Iran faces a lot of challenges, definitely. We know that, geopolitically, economically, etc., etc. Iran, unlike Saudi Arabia or others, Iran is not allowed to join the economic mainstream, geopolitical mainstream, etc., etc. So they look at these two countries as pivotal, vital for their interests. So irrespective of the disappointment or whatever they have, they would prefer to continue to maintain that close relationship with these two. And they are doing that. But there are some disagreements as well, because both China and Russia have also voiced their support for finding a solution to the Iranian nuclear program through diplomacy, which in some other way is both countries opposing Iran's advanced nuclear program. So they are not pretty comfortable with Iran's nuclear program. That's why they say that they prefer a solution to the Iranian nuclear program, but through diplomacy, not through force.
Right.
So there are some disagreements like that, and I'm sure that the Iranians wouldn't have been happy when the Syrian government fell in November 2024,
Yeah.
because the Russians originally played a role in turning around the civil war in 2015, and the Iranians actually fought in the battlefield. The Russians provided the air cover. The Iranians fought. Iranians built a Shia militia. They fought in the battlefield alongside the regime of Bashar al-Assad in Syria to turn around the civil war. But then in November, they just saw that the Syrian government melting away.
Right.
And Bashar al-Assad fled to Moscow. The Russians did nothing. The Russians may have their own excuses because they are preoccupied with their own war in their backyard in Europe. But the Iranians saw that their influence practically, flowing away, melting away in the region. And if the Syrian government was there, the Israelis wouldn't have bombed Iran earlier this year. So, Iran witnessed these changes in the region, and they may have their own disagreements, their own disappointments, but still they continue to maintain very close economic and strategic ties with these two countries.
Now, talking about India. So, India has had a very long relationship with Iran in terms of, be it cultural, economic, strategic, diplomatic, all of these. So, what is the relationship between India and Iran to start with?
I mean, economically, culturally, we have always enjoyed very good ties with the Iranians.
Yeah.
Before the revolution, after the revolution. So the cultural ties go back centuries, right?
Yeah.
I mean, it's a very deep relationship between two civilizations.
Yeah.
I'm not going into those details, but if you look at modern Iran India ties, I think after we became independent in the early 1950s, we established a full diplomatic relationship with Iran, and after the revolution, there was a period when there was a period of friction between these two, when Iran had offered support for the cause of Kashmir immediately after the revolution. But the problem, 1979, we should also look at the broader geopolitical picture from Iran's point of view. After the revolution, Iran moved away from the United States, right?
Yeah.
And then Iran started looking at the United States as the great Satan. And Pakistan was an American ally. Pakistan was a member of SEATO and CENTO, a treaty ally of the United States. So, and Pakistan had a particular policy towards Kashmir. So the Iranians, on the one side, they had that Islamic, let's say, solidarity with the cause of Kashmir. While on the other side, they also saw that the Pakistanis are trying to champion the same, that identity-based politics in Kashmir. So with which the Iranians were not very comfortable, because they didn't trust the Pakistanis. Pakistanis were an American ally, and Iran shares a long border with Pakistan. They always had that problem. So what they did was that, of course, they initially supported the Kashmir cause, but they never endorsed the Pakistani claims over Kashmir.
Right.
So the Pakistanis were also not very happy. So if you give them Pakistan and India, the Iranians would pick the Indians because they were much more suspicious about the Pakistanis. And there were examples. For example, in 1994, when Rao was the prime minister, the Organization of Islamic Countries, the OIC, so they were drafting a resolution practically attacking India over alleged human rights violations in Kashmir.
Right.
And then this resolution would go to the UN HRC, Human Rights Council. And if it passed in the UN Human Rights Council, it will go to the Security Council. And the Security Council could even, it might pass in the Security Council because the Russians were there, the Soviets were there. But, I mean, theoretically speaking, the Security Council could suggest sanctions, right? So it was Iran that stopped the resolution at the OIC. So Iran, this was a Pakistan-sponsored resolution. This was in 1994. The Iranians voted out. They broke with the consensus, so the resolution wasn't passed.
Right.
So Iran always had taken such position, they had issued solidarity with Kashmir, but at the same time, they always insisted, including President Rouhani, recently, a few years ago, President Rouhani had also said that they prefer a solution to Kashmir through dialogue, not through any military force.
Right.
But they always maintained very good relationship with Israel, even about Kashmir. On other matters, I'm talking about India and Iran, okay? On other matters, they maintained very close ties.
Right.
If you look at closer to our times, especially in the new century, after the Taliban regime fell down in Afghanistan, even when the last time when the Taliban were in power, 1990, in the late 1990s, both the Indians and the Iranians and the Russians and the Central Asians always stood together against the Taliban regime, previous Taliban regime, and they supported the Northern Alliance. And once the Taliban were out, India started building very strong ties with the new Afghan government, right? The Islamic Republic of Afghanistan. So, but India doesn't have direct access towards Afghanistan. And that access should go towards basically through Iran.
Yes.
So, it was in early 2000s that India signed the Chabahar Agreement, which would take off. It would take a long time for India to complete the initial construction of Chabahar. But Chabahar also, with Chabahar in Iran, India has an alternate route to Afghanistan and then to Central Asia, bypassing Pakistan. So that's very important. So you have the connectivity projects, and you also had India used to have very good energy ties with Iran. Iran is closer to India compared to other energy sources. But unfortunately, the Indian government, previous governments, successive governments decided to curtail energy cooperation with Israel, with Iran, because of pressure from the United States. India's official position is that India will comply by only the UN mandated sanctions. But sanctions were basically imposed by the United States on Iran, but India still decided to comply with the terms. And now India is again under pressure to stop investing in Chabahar. Because again, the Americans did not like that. And interestingly, in 2024, India had signed an agreement with the Iranians. It was a 10-year lease to operate Chabahar. So from 2024 to 34, Indians would continue to operate Chabahar. But Indians are also expected to make further investments in Chabahar and associated infrastructure in building a road network, rail network, etc., which is already going very slow. I remember talking to an Iranian diplomat, a very senior Iranian diplomat in Tehran, who told me that your Qibla is Washington. They were actually upset with the Indians because the construction process was very slow. So all these issues were going on. But despite this, India always tried to maintain its relationship with Iran because Iran is India's gateway to Central Asia. Oil you can buy from the Russians, from the Saudis, from the Iraqis, even from the Americans. But you can't swap your geography, right? It's a given. You need to work with that. So if you look at geography in India's continental foreign policy, in India's policy towards the Eurasian landmass, Iran is important, and Iran will continue to play an important role, which also requires India to maintain the balance in its West Asia policy between different players.
That brings me to my next question. So how does it affect India's foreign relations because of its ties with Iran? Be it its its relationship with China and Russia, or its relationship with Israel and Saudi Arabia and the US. So how does it affect India's position with all these countries while also having close ties with Iran?
It's not an easy task. I don't think the Indians will have a problem with Iran having good ties with the Chinese or the Russians. Because especially with Russia and Iran, India has always coordinated in tackling India's continental challenges. Because Iran also, India faced, when it comes to tackling terrorism or when it comes to tackling other security issues in the continental side. So the Iranians had always cooperated with India, right? The Iranians had done that, the Russians had done that. So when it comes to these issues, I think India and China are also in the same camp. India has a border problem with China, that's a different matter. But when it comes to issues related to the Eurasian landmass, Iran's relationship with China and Russia is not a threat, is not a challenge to India. But a bigger challenge to India is that Iran is practically Iran's hostile relationship with the United States,
Yeah.
Iran's hostile relationship with Israel,
Yeah.
Iran's somewhat hostile relationship with the Arab world.
Right.
So India has very good ties with the Israelis. India has good ties with the Arab world. India has very good ties with the Americans. So the challenge before India is to maintain this balance.
Yeah.
I mean, India doesn't want to completely antagonize the Iranians because, as I said earlier, Iran is important for India.
Yeah.
But at the same time, India doesn't want to upset the Americans and the Israelis either. Okay. So India, I mean, this is the struggle. This is what India is trying to do. So if you look at the Chabahar agreement, which I talked
Yeah.
about, India signed the Chabahar agreement in 2024. So 2024 means a few months after the October 7 attack.
Yeah.
So the October 7 attack opened a new chapter of hostility between the Israelis and the Iranians.
Yeah.
So India decided to ignore that
Right.
and go ahead with this agreement with Iran because India realized that Chabahar is important. Because Chabahar is important not only because of its connectivity to Afghanistan, but also because India is part of the North-South Transport Corridor, International North-South Transport Corridor, which connects India's western coast with Russia and then Europe. And Iran, Azerbaijan, and then Russia, they all play a major role in the corridor. And now the link of the corridor is Bandar Abbas, Iran's. But there are plans to connect the corridor to Chabahar, which means it will come closer to India.
Right.
Whether it is the North-South Transport Corridor or whether as a gateway to Central Asia, Iran plays a major role. So India realizes this, right? But at the same time, the Israelis are not very happy, would not be happy with India's ties with Iran. And India, especially the current government, doesn't want to upset the Israelis. So India should also realize that Israel's militarism in the region, Israel's aggression in the region, it doesn't serve India's interests. Because on the one side, Iran, if the Israel-Iran war spills over into the Gulf, that would be a nightmarish scenario for India because millions of Indians are working in the Gulf. India is also dependent on the region for energy, right? And Iran is an important partner. So, which means if the war spills over into the region, I mean, this is not going to serve any of India's interests. And recently we saw the Qatar attack by Israel. Again, we discussed it in one of our InFocused podcast episodes. 800,000 Indians are working there in Qatar. Qatar is also India's largest supplier of LNG. Aggression in this region, Israeli aggression in this region is not helping India. It's not serving India's interests. So India is expected to take a much more stronger vocal position, which we are not doing it at this point of time. But when Qatar was attacked, India's response was much more stronger, right? India condemned the violation of Qatar's sovereignty, which was a very strong statement issued by the Prime Minister himself, because India's interests are on the line. So the same thing is applicable to Iran as well, right? So yes, it is lopsided. As I said earlier, the Iranians are upset. The Iranians say that India's direction is Washington. They are also upset that the infrastructure projects are moving very slow. So these are the issues that we need to address. Of course, we need to maintain our relationship with the Americans, but we should also take the promises of the investments, the agreements that we have signed seriously. We should learn to execute those projects rather quickly like the Chinese do. And we should maintain our corridors of influence in Iran as well, like we have on the other side. So I think, what does it tell us is that maintaining the equilibrium, maintaining the balance in your West Asia policy is important. So you shouldn't let one side overwhelm your policy towards the other side.
So finally, before we end this discussion, let's talk about Iran's relationship with the US. So under the Shah, Iran was one of US's most, closest allies. But right after the 1979 revolution, it's become Washington's one of its worst rivals. So what drove this drastic change in the relationship between these two?
Both ideology and I think history played a role in this. So history means, the United States supported the Shah. And Shah was a hated figure in 1979 in Iran. And we discussed the 1950s coup, 53 coup in Iran, where the Shah had left the country and the Americans and the British orchestrated a coup and brought the Shah back to power in Iran.
Yeah.
So, that what do you say, that hostility towards, that bad feeling about the United States, that was pretty strong in Iran's new collective psyche in the 1970s, which was revolutionary. That revolutionary fervor was there. It was channeled by the Islamists. But as we saw earlier, it was not just an Islamic revolution. It was a revolution that was pumped by different factions of society. Trade unionists, left-wingers, liberals, Islamists, clergy. All of them had participated in the anti-Shah protests in Iran, right? And they saw Shah as the embodiment of evil, the villain. And the villain was backed by the United States. And the United States' main ally in the region was Israel. So the United States became the great Satan and Israel became the Chota Satan. So that's how the new Iranians looked at it. And then, plus what happened, as if, like putting salt on the wound, what happened was that the revolutionaries took over the American embassy. And the American embassy, the embassy staff were held hostages for more than a year. The Americans never forgave that. We are talking about the world's most powerful country, and their embassy was overrun. Their staff were hostages. When President Carter was there in power, Jimmy Carter, he tried to rescue the embassy staff. He launched a military operation which turned out to be disastrous. He couldn't rescue them. So finally they had to wait till the Iranians let them go. It took time. It took months. So the Americans never forgave them, right? And then the Iraq war broke out. Again, in the Iraq war, the Americans were directly supporting the Iraqis. The Gulf Arabs were supporting the Iraqis. The Iranians again felt that, okay, the Americans, they supported the Shah. Now that the Shah is gone, they are supporting the murderous invading Iraqi army to attack us, to destroy us. So that feeling is getting thickened, right? Is becoming deepened in Iran's psyche. So, and then the ideological reason is also there, because now you have an Islamic republic. So Islam is everything. Islam is the ideology for Khomeini. And Khomeini looked at the United States and saw a geopolitical hegemon and also a cultural enemy. Because the Western values were against the values which Khomeini thought he was representing. So that ideological angle is also there. So Khomeini opposed the United States as the pinnacle of evilness, the great Satan. And he also opposed the United States because the United States was backing anti-Iran forces. The United States was backing the deposed Shah, and who posed a threat to Khomeini's power. And the United States was backing Iraq, who is invading the new Iran. So you can look at all these elements, and you can add the ideology of the new Islamic revolutionary ideology of Imam Khomeini. Then the split is widening, right? And then, regionally, whatever happened in the region, the Iran-Iraq war was over. And in the 1990s, there was a brief period when the Iranians genuinely showed interest in improving ties with the United States. Especially when Khatami was the president. So Khatami was a moderate. And Khatami became president in the 1990s. And Khatami was open to, late 1990s, Khatami was open to building better ties with the United States. And in 2001, after the September 11 attack, 2001, when the United States declared war against the Taliban, the Iranians offered full intelligence cooperation with the Americans. Because Iran was a neighboring country of Afghanistan, right? The Iranians cooperated with them, and they hoped Khatami was one of the first leaders who condemned the September 11 attack. The Iranians hoped that would lead to a turn in the page of the relationship between the two countries. But what the Americans would do after the Taliban were overthrown, President Bush would give his speech, I think this was in 2002, calling Iran one of the countries in his axis of evil. So Iraq, Iran and North Korea. And in 2003, they started attacking Iraq. So which means the next country would obviously be Iran. So Iranians felt threatened. So what the Iranians did, they wanted to slow down the Iraqi invasion, the American invasion of Iraq. So they started building these militia groups, and then they started attacking the American soldiers in Iraq.
Right.
So basically the Iranian strategy was to entrap the Americans in Iraq, which was a successful strategy at that point of time. So you see, there were back-to-back developments when the relationship deteriorated over the years. It has a historical reason, ideological reason, now geopolitical reason. So it has deteriorated over the years.
Right.
But the Iranians have occasionally shown interest in improving ties. One is Mohammad Khatami, and the other is when Mohammad Rouhani was the president. He became president in 2013. Barack Obama was the president in the United States, and he was willing to do business with the Americans. So there was this 2-year-long negotiations between the Iranians and the Americans and the world powers, the Russians, the Europeans, the Chinese, everybody was involved. And then in 2015, they reached the JCPOA and the agreement was signed, as part of which Iran decided to scuttle its nuclear program in return for the United States lifting the sanctions.
Right.
So again, we saw a moment where the Americans and the Israelis, Americans and the Iranians cooperating to resolve the highly contentious nuclear program through diplomacy. But then what happened? Obama was out in 2016. Trump came to power. And in 2018, he will withdraw the United States unilaterally from the JCPOA, even when the UN was saying that Iran was 100% compliant with the terms of the agreement.
Right.
So Trump would practically sabotage the nuclear agreement. So the nuclear agreement was gone in 2018. The United States would reimpose sanctions on Iran. Then Iran would start violating the terms of the nuclear agreement and start their enrichment process.
Right.
So, I mean, you can find incidents. Incidents are here like a chain reaction, right? So it leads from one to the other, and everything contributed to the rapid decline of the relationship between the two.
Right. I think that brings us to the end of this episode on Iran. Thank you so much for joining.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Iran's story is one of ambition, influence, and strategic balancing, where every move in Baghdad, Damascus, Tehran, or Jawahar carries implications far beyond its borders. From historic ties with India to its role in global power politics, Tehran's choices continue to shape regional dynamics and global alliances. As the region faces new conflicts and old rivalries simmer on, one thing is clear. Understanding Iran is key to understanding the future of West Asia. Join us next time as we continue to trace the fault lines shaping our world. This is Global Fault Lines, the Hindu's International Affairs podcast, and I am Sharmada Venkata Subramanian.